The Gigabyte P57X V6 is the fastest notebook that I've gotten my hands on thus far. Boasting a Core i7-6700HQ CPU with the GTX 1070 GPU, it's definitely a beast of a machine. But before I dive into performance numbers, let's take a look around the rest of the notebook first. For the rest of the specs on the P57X, there's 4 SODIMM slots for up to 32 gigabytes of RAM, with my model coming with 16 gigs. Also note that it can come in 2133 or 2400 MHz variants. For Wi-Fi, it uses an Intel dual-band AC card for up to 867 megabits per second transfer speeds. There's a PCIe SSD up to 512 gigabytes in storage and up to a 2 terabyte hard drive, with my review model having 256 gigabytes and 1 terabyte respectively. Gigabyte also includes an accessory in the box to swap out the front-mounted optical drive for a third drive with a 2.5-inch adapter for up to a total of 3 storage drives on the notebook. On the exterior, the P57X is mostly a smooth black finish with some minor orange accents and a chrome Gigabyte logo on the lid. The lid, coming with a one-finger lift, holds the 17.3-inch 1080p 60Hz IPS panel. The display, while certainly vibrant in color and hosting wide viewing angles, at least on my review sample, came with some pretty obvious backlight bleed.
The 720p 30fps webcam and microphone at the top of the panel are of okay quality, just really a continuation of the trend of mediocre webcam setups on a gaming notebook.
The full layout 30-key rollover anti-ghosting keyboard features some decent backlighting, and the keys are relatively decent to type on, but a bit too mushy for my taste. The touchpad has a smooth finish without dedicated buttons. The general tracking of the touchpad is sufficient, but clicking accuracy is a bit subpar, as is the case on most touchpads without physical buttons. If you clearly right-click by being just past the line, it's registered as a left click until you're about halfway over on the designated right-click area. Super frustrating at times. Also, I want to note that there was a constant small vibration that you could feel under the touchpad, which is likely caused by the optical drive chassis being so close to the surface of the touchpad. Note, I'm simply talking about the chassis, not the drive actually spinning that causes vibration, as it happened whether the drive slot was in or out. Battery life, however, is one of the things that I can't complain about with this notebook. The PC Mark 8 battery life test yielded a result of 4 hours and 13 minutes on the 75 watt-hour battery, over double what I've seen on the 10 series MSI notebooks I've reviewed thus far. With regards to I/O, you get a Kensington lock, gigabit Ethernet, dual USB 3.0, an SD card reader, and headphone out plus mic in on the left. And on the right, you have power in, VGA out for some strange reason, HDMI 2.0 out, USB Type-C non-Thunderbolt, and another USB 3.0 port. Gigabyte also includes their Smart Manager software on the machine that allows you to control basically everything you want in a single location. Those features include adjusting the fan profile on the machine and even overclocking the GPU. Spending some time on that overclock option, it's not the most impressive thing. All it does is up the memory clock on the 8GB of GDDR5 memory by 50 MHz increments for a total memory overclock of 200 MHz. The effects of such an overclock are usually far less substantial than that of a core overclock, but also the least likely to affect the thermal performance of the notebook, so I can see why Gigabyte opted to go that route. I don't really see a reason to set the notebook to anything below the highest level of overclock they offer here, as it didn't yield higher temperatures in my testing, with the GPU still hitting 83 degrees Celsius. And there is some performance gain, even if it may be less than 1% impact depending on the game that you're playing. So with that, all of the benchmarks that were done with that 200 MHz memory overclock applied. But before I get into the numbers, let's take a look at the thermal performance of the notebook. Both the CPU and GPU never reached above 83 degrees Celsius, which allowed the GTX 1070 to maintain a boost clock of 1740 MHz. Checking out the heat dispersion with the FLIR 1 from Wootware, you can see that the right side of the keyboard gets super hot during gaming use to a really uncomfortable level. However, the WASD keys remain relatively cool, coming in at around 34 degrees or so. Overall, the notebook gets fairly toasty while gaming, but stays cool where you need it to be. Fan noise isn't too bad overall either, with it coming to 64 decibels under full load. Now looking at the gaming performance of the GTX 1070 on the P57X. While the mobile GTX 1070 sports 128 more CUDA cores, it still performs at about 90% of what you can expect from a non-reference GTX 1070, and again, this is with a 200 MHz memory overclock applied. The frame rates are entirely respectable for the 1080p 60Hz panel, even if it's a bit overkill for most games at this resolution and refresh rate. However, it appears that the P57X will be able to handle most games at max detail settings for some time to come with this GPU. The $2,000 price point is about what you can expect to pay for a GTX 1070 equipped notebook. Nothing to write home about there. But here in South Africa, the Gigabyte P57X is basically the cheapest 1070 equipped notebook that you can find. And that's not because the notebook is cheaply built either. Sure, it doesn't scream gamer with RGB LEDs, fancy logo placement, or with the fact that it includes a VGA out port, but it packs a lot of necessary features that make it worthwhile in my mind. The battery life is fantastic compared to 1060 equipped notebooks I've tested thus far, has enough USB ports for my taste, even if it does lack Thunderbolt, has more storage options than most, and is compact enough to not be obstructive without compromising on thermal performance. It's a low-key, high-powered gaming notebook that looks and feels like it belongs more in an office environment. The touchpad would be the only thing that I would practically complain about here, but that's easily overcome with a mouse, and then the backlight bleed will be on a unit-by-unit basis with all IPS panels being subject to having it. Gigabyte has produced a notebook that will be at the top of my list when I'm looking to upgrade next time around. And with that conclusion, I'd like to thank Gigabyte South Africa for sending the P57X V6 notebook over for review. You can like this video if you found it helpful at all, dislike it if you disagree with me or my conclusions. Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all of my tech-related content, and I will see you guys in the next video. Cheers. But here in South Africa, the Gigabyte P57X is basically the cheapest. It's cheapest.